Hey Rajani, how are you? Oh, 1 second. I think I can hear you. Can you try talking again, Rajani? Having trouble hearing you. Samir, are you also having trouble hearing Rajani?
Yes, Rajani, we can't hear you. Alyssa, are you able to hear me?
I can hear you. It doesn't look like your microphone was muted, so. Yeah, we're still unable to hear you, unfortunately, Rajani. Okay. So how's it going, Samir?
Good, Alyssa. How are you today?
I am surviving. I'm sure you can hear I'm a little sick, so.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I hope you feel better soon.
That's okay. Thank you. So yeah, just it's that time of year in Michigan. The weather's all crazy. Um, it was just like 70 yesterday, and then the day before that it was like a low of 43. So it's just crazy over here.
It's that time of the year where you have those ups and downs, and that
Um,
you never know what to expect from one day to the next.
Yeah, exactly. So I think my allergies are just angry. Hey,
Alyssa,
Reggie.
are you able to hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. Samir,
Okay.
can you hear?
Samir,
Hey,
are
yes,
you able to
we can hear you.
Good. All right. Well, we'll give everybody a minute to join, and then we can go ahead and get started. So, I was just telling Samir about I've got a little illness here, so I'm chugging along tonight. I'm trying to make it through, so hopefully my voice holds up.
Oh no.
Just some
Well,
head congestion.
thank you for joining us.
Yeah, no problem. It's really not that bad. I think it's just the weather is all weird, so it's probably messing with my allergies a little bit.
Oh.
Yeah, so but how's the weather in Texas? Is it still hot there at least?
It is hot. I don't know, maybe 85 today. It's very unseasonably warm for almost Halloween to be this warm.
Yeah, that's very hot.
Yeah.
I was
I
just
mean, in
telling
the morning.
Samir.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just telling Samir that it was just 70 degrees here yesterday, which is very abnormal for Michigan weather in October. So very weird things going on.
Oh, everywhere.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, I think we can go ahead and get started. We'll have more people trickling in as the webinar goes on, but I think that we can go ahead and start here. So I'll go ahead and start us off. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our webinar series, Residency Real Talk with Dr. Samir Desai. We're very excited to have you here tonight. And if I haven't met you before, my name is Alyssa Harlow, and I'm the Director of Marketing here at MD2B Connect. We have a very special guest with us tonight, Dr. Rajani Katta. Thank you for joining us, Rajani. And so tonight we're going to be answering some of the questions that you submitted using our Google form that we had sent out. So we're going to spend a majority of our time going over that. However, if you do have questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll save some time at the end to answer those. So I did also want to mention that if you guys have any questions about anything, about your rotations, about guidance, about, something going on in the match that you have a question about, feel free to reach out to anybody on our team. We're here to help you, and you're part of our MD2B Connect family. We really want to be able to, help you out through this and answer any questions or doubts that you guys may have. So please feel free to reach out to anyone on our team, including Dr. Samir Desai, and we'd be happy to help you. With that said, throughout the webinar, I'm going to be sending out a multitude of different resources, including YouTube videos, links to blog posts, and some other things to help you based on the topics that we're going over tonight, which is going to be about the residency interview. So keep an eye out in the chat for that. You may want to save some of those, so feel free to click on that link and save that for yourself. So without further ado, I will go ahead and pass it off to an introduction for Dr. Samir Desai.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Alyssa, and welcome to everybody. We're glad that you could join us today for our webinar that we're devoting entirely to your questions about the residency interview, because it's that time of year again where everybody is thinking very deeply about the questions that you're going to be asked in these interviews and how best to answer them. And so welcome also to our new rotators. I know that most of you I've spoken with personally, but if you are new to our program, know that I'll be reaching out to you soon to talk about your experience and your situation and give you tips that are specific to you. One of the things that we try to do here in our MD2B Connect program is really try to personalize our experience with you and try to, help you understand how best to present yourselves in your different aspects of the residency application process. And that includes the interview. And so I want to give you a little bit of background about my experience in interviewing. Of course, way back when I was on your side of the table and getting ready for my own residency interviews. So I try not to forget about what that's like. And since then, I've sat on the other side of the table and have done a lot of interviewing for our internal medicine residency program at the Baylor College of Medicine. And so I've learned a lot about interviewing from those experiences and sat on the residency selection committee at several different medical schools. So I've learned a lot about what my colleagues are looking for in these interviews. And because I do a lot of mentoring at Baylor and certainly in our MD2B Connect program, I'm always trying to stay current with information about residency interviewing. And that's why I'm glad that I'm going to be able to share as much of that with you today as possible. Just as a reminder, we have a lot of interview resources in the red book that most of you have. And if you're new to our program, you'll be getting it soon. That's the book called The Successful Match. There are 150 pages of interview prep in that book. And we have some additional resources as well. So you all have been to our MD2B Connect website, but we have a sister website called thesuccessfulmatch.com. And on that website, we have an extensive blog with many blog posts devoted to different aspects of the residency interview. So those blog posts are meant to complement what's in your red book. And in addition to that, we have a podcast at that same website called Success in Medicine, where we have done some episodes on, again, different aspects of the residency interview process. And so I'm happy to be here with you today to answer all these great questions you all have submitted. And before we get into those questions, I want to introduce Dr. Rajani Katta. She was also at Baylor for a long, long time as a professor of dermatology, and she was very involved in medical education there, serving as director of the basic sciences for the medical students there, clerkship director for the dermatology rotation, and certainly residency selection committee member in the Department of Dermatology. So Rajani, I'll hand it over to you.
So welcome to all of you. And we are really excited to try to give you a behind the scenes look at what residency selection committees are looking for. So as Dr. Desai mentioned, I was a former professor of dermatology at the Baylor College of Medicine, and I served on their residency selection committee for 17 years. And during that time, I had the great privilege of meeting some of the top medical students in the country. So every year we would interview students from around the country who were interested in dermatology. And one of the things that really struck me was that these were some of the top medical students in the entire country, and they had done amazing work. And yet, after a day of interviewing 15 medical students or 15 applicants, sometimes I would find it hard to distinguish between them. And there were always maybe one or two that stood out to me that were memorable, but it really struck me how difficult it was to distinguish between these amazing applicants. And I started to really pay close attention to why were some applicants more memorable than others. And it wasn't that they had the top scores or the most amazing research. It was really that they were able to make a compelling case for why they would be a great fit for Baylor's program. And that was some of the inspiration behind us including so much information about interview prep in the Successful Match book. And then we have tried to release a lot of additional information online to really try to highlight how important it is to take the time to really customize your responses. And I will tell you that one of the mistakes I saw multiple times was that it almost felt like students had all read the same exact blog post. So what questions do you have for me? And I would hear the same questions over and over again. It was almost like everybody was looking at the same blog post in order to answer these questions. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Where do you see yourself in 15 years? And so that's really the impetus behind us putting out so much information online, on the podcast, in our residency interview course. And we've really tried to break these questions down so that you can create those unique, memorable responses. So I think we're going to start going into your questions one by one. And between Dr. Desai and I, we will add a lot of that behind the scenes information. So how do your responses land on the person on the other side of the desk?
All right. I think with that, we can dive straight into the questions. So I'll go ahead and start us off with the first one. Our first question was just a generic question about LOI advice. So if either one of you want to go ahead and start.
Sure, I'll take that. So LOI. So these are letters of interest. These are communications that are sent to residency programs, generally after you've submitted your application. The hope is by sending that communication to a residency program that will prompt them to take a closer look at your application. And by doing that, you would then earn an interview invite. And so these communications have traditionally been fairly important. They continue to hold importance even here in this cycle. Before you send a letter of interest, one of the things you want to do is make sure that it's okay to send that letter. So you want to visit each program's website looking for any specific language related to letters of interest. There are some programs that have policies prohibiting that. And obviously you would want to know that so you don't break any rules. So that's the first step. If there is nothing prohibiting you from sending that letter of interest, then the next thing to think about is when to send it. So now that we're about 1 month past September 27th, which was the first day that programs could look at your applications, now is the time to really give that some serious thought. And the reason I say that is enough time has passed for programs to get into their review process. So on the 27th, they are flooded with so many applications, and it takes them some time to get through that. So ideally, you want to send those letter of interests between the time you submit your application and before interview invites are given out. Now, programs differ in the way that they give out their interview invitations. So they may decide to release all their interview invitations all at once, but some programs will do it in batches. And so right now, with where we're at here in the last week of October, this is a good time to send that out. Now, we do have a podcast episode on the Success in Medicine podcast that gives you some guidance on how to construct these letters. So Alyssa, I don't know if you can include that. That's the podcast episode on how your emails that you send to residency programs can prevent you from getting interviews. We'll try to include that in the chat so that you can listen to that podcast episode, and that will help in constructing that letter of interest.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and find that and add it in the chat here in a moment. With that, I think we can move on to our next question. And our next question is about acknowledgement emails. So somebody asked, do acknowledgement emails mean that we have passed their initial filters, or are they insignificant?
So acknowledgement emails, if they are sent at all by the program, mean that they have received your application. And so it's not insignificant. It means something that they've received it, but they have yet to go through it. Now, when you receive an acknowledgement email, it's very important to read that email very carefully because they often provide additional information. For example, some programs may communicate in that correspondence that their interview offers will be released after a certain date. Well, that's very helpful information to have. They may also share in that acknowledgement email any policies they have about receiving communications from applicants after you submit the application. In some cases, that information isn't on the program website. So if in the acknowledgement email they indicate that, hey, we have a lot of applications and we have received yours, please give us time to look through these, and we kindly ask that you don't send us any communications as we are feverishly working through this. You want to respect anything that they put out there in that acknowledgement email. So there is important information sometimes in those emails that you want to keep in mind.
Okay. And I just sent out the podcast for the last question about how emails to residency programs can prevent you from receiving residency interviews. So that's in there now for you guys. On to our third question. Somebody asked, audition rotation I did hasn't sent any interview invite. Why is that, and what can I do, and do I wait?
I'll go ahead and take that one. So I mentored a lot of medical students who were going to dermatology, and we know that audition electives are really a fantastic strategy to try to express your interest to a particular residency program. And they're also an amazing opportunity to highlight your skills and your amazing attributes, and especially your fit with this program. So first of all, I would ask, do you know that the program has already sent out interview invites? So depending on the specialty and depending on the specific program, there may not have been interview invites sent out at all at this time. Now, if you know that other people have gotten interview invites and you have not, that can be concerning. It may be that they have decided not to interview you, or alternatively, perhaps you are going to be in the next round of interview invites. But the second part of that question is important, and that's the part about what can you do. So hopefully, if you rotated at a particular program, that you made some connections there. Hopefully with a faculty member, although that's not always possible. However, hopefully you were able to connect with some of the residents, or at least one of the residents that you're able to stay in touch with. And so if you have a faculty member contact there, you could reach out to the faculty member and you could express your sincere and deep interest in this residency program. And then ask, do you know when interview invites might be sent? And if so, am I under consideration? So that's a way of expressing your interest in the program. You could also ask a resident the same question. And it's interesting because a lot of students I find don't realize how much sway residents, current residents, hold in a residency program's decision-making process. So in our dermatology program, we would ask our residents for their opinion. So if there were students who didn't audition elective, or our own students, our own home medical school students, we would ask the residents for their opinion. And so the residents were then able to go back to the attendings, to the faculty members, and give them some of their own thoughts. So if you did make a connection with a resident, you could ask them. I know other people have gotten interviews. I was wondering if you knew if there were additional interviews, invitations going out, and if not, do you think it might be worthwhile if I reached out to try to express my interest again? Or alternatively, if you're very close to the resident, do you think you might be able to recommend me as a potential interview invitee? So I think the main thing there is to use whatever connections that you have made at that program to approach the program. It's a little trickier if you've had no connections at all, just going to the program coordinator and asking. It doesn't work as well, but as an absolute last resort, you could ask simply if they knew, at this point you may not have anything to lose. You could ask them if it is possible that additional interview invites are going out. Samir, do you have anything to add to that?
No, those are great points, Rajani. I will say from my own personal experience, so, over the last 24 years at Baylor, I have had students who have visited our department from different US med schools, and we've also had international medical students who've done rotations in our internal medicine department. And sometimes I work with these students, and they may reach out to me during the early part of the interview season, just giving me an update about what's going on and where they're at, and reiterating their interest in Baylor, and as Rajani mentioned, just keeping those lines of communication open, and inviting me to give them some thoughts on what might be going on and what next steps might be reasonable to take. It's not unheard of for a faculty member or a resident, after you reach out to them, to reach out to their PD on your behalf, and just make mention of your name. And sometimes that is what it takes just to get a closer look at your application, and that pushes you into the interview pile. So I think in this situation, taking stock of who you worked with and just kind of reaching out to them and letting them know kind of where things are at, and just starting that conversation.
All right, I think that was some great advice. I think that we can move on to the next question. So our next question is asking about attempt filters. It's saying, is there a specific attempt filter on the ERAS program director's workspace?
Yeah, so there are numbers that they use. Okay, traditionally they've been able to filter based on step scores, and what they can do is they can assign a threshold number, or they can assign some sort of range for filtering. If the exam is only pass fail, then they could set a pass fail filter, but typically if it's numerically scored, they are using numbers. Now there can be manual filtering, so if they use some numerical filters to narrow the applicant pool from a larger number down to the smaller number, as they're going through it, they can take a look and see if there's an attempt history. So that can be done as well, but it's the numbers that they look at if it's a numerical scored exam.
Okay. Our next question is about, if a program states we prefer year of graduation 3 years or less, is it considered from date of application or date of joining the residency program?
Yeah, so there's a bit of difference in the way the program directors look at this. Some will look at it from the date of application, and others would look at it the other way. So there's just a difference in opinion of how your YOG is looked at.
I want to add to that too, that sometimes it does say on the residency program website, it'll specify sometimes whether it's from the actual graduation date or not. So that's also can be helpful on the website as well.
Exactly. Just to add to that, Alyssa, and I'm glad you brought that up, is programs are trying to be a little more specific in terms of transparency. So what Alyssa said, is very true. There are some programs who will tell you how they define YOG, and then that can be very helpful in deciding, is that going to be a program you apply to, deciding, what your chances are. So we're not where we need to be with that type of transparency, but I am seeing a bit more of that, as Alyssa mentioned.
All right. So for our next question, it asks, if a program, oh, sorry, that's the one we just did, my bad. The next one says, if department chair from medical school, and that's an Indian medical school it's referring to, sends an email to a program requesting consideration, would that hold any value?
So this time of the year, program directors get a lot of emails from applicants, sometimes several hundred a day. So that's a big job for them to process all those emails. Fewer emails come from faculty, attendings, or preceptors, whether that's people that you've worked with in the US or people with whom you've worked internationally in your home country. And so an email like that can stick out because it's different. It's not the typical emails that are coming through. And there is, belief among some program directors that if, one of their colleagues, even if it's somebody that they don't know, is taking the time to craft something like that, that means something. And, that can be what it takes to get your application noticed a bit more. So ideally, that would take place from somebody that the program director knows, but even people that the program director doesn't know, again, whether it's in the US or another country, those can be effective if those emails are written well.
Okay, on to our next question. This is a big question I think most people have questions about. How should we tackle questions on low step scores?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. It's one that's on the minds of a lot of people. So the first step in how to answer a question about your step scores is to think very deeply about what it is that happened on your step exam that led to that score. So that can be very different from applicant to applicant, but I have seen all kinds of things, everything from, personal health problem to an issue with someone's family. Maybe there's a loved one who wasn't doing well in terms of their health. It could be any one of a number of things that contributed to that lower score. And when residency programs see that lower score, they of course don't know you. They don't know, everything you have to offer. They don't know that you have this great knowledge base and that you're a great problem solver because they don't know you personally. And so they get concerned, right, when they see the low score. So your job in crafting an answer to that is to give them an answer that would reassure them that whatever it is that happened is understandable, and that you have taken steps and taken actions to remedy those factors that led to that score. And hopefully, by doing that, you can point to some other things that give them evidence that they shouldn't worry about you. So if that means that your step 2 score was low and then you've taken the step 3 and you pass that, then that could be part of the evidence that you give. If you have a lower step 2 score but haven't yet taken step 3, then you might point to some other things in your background. For example, you might talk in your answer about your US clinical experience and just how much you've done and how rigorous those experiences have been, and how you've acquired feedback through those experiences. And that feedback includes information about your knowledge base and your diagnostic reasoning. And you can share with them that the feedback you've gotten, it indicates that you're where you need to be to transition into residency and be a successful resident. So you have to kind of, again, think about what led to the issue, what steps or measures you've taken to fix those issues, and what evidence you have to provide that will reassure them that it's not going to follow you into residency.
Okay, so moving on to our next question. Our next question is, what are good questions to ask programs?
This one, and I want to give a few examples of sort of before and after questions. And we've either put up a video or about to put up a video where I describe some of the before and after questions, taking sort of very common responses and then how you can make them better. And then a several step process for how you can craft your own questions. So as I mentioned before, sometimes at the end of a day of 15 amazing applicants, they start to blur together. And I would ask typically at the end of the interview, as a signal that I was wrapping up, So it was such a pleasure to meet you, Anne. Do you have any questions for me? And that was a signal that I was wrapping up. And it is a good idea to ask at least one question. And sometimes a faculty member might leave you a lot of room, and you might have to ask 2 or 3 questions to fill the time. So it's good to have at least several questions prepared ahead of time. And I'll tell you that the most common questions that I heard were things like, can you tell me about the strengths of the program? Do you anticipate any changes occurring over the next few years in this program? Can you tell me about any aspects of the program that are considered challenges or weaknesses of the program? So those were very typical questions that I heard over and over again. And that's what I meant when I said earlier that sometimes it felt like people were reading from a blog post and pulling out questions from that blog post to ask. And it also felt like they were just asking the question because they felt as though they needed to ask a question. So I think it is important to ask a question. I don't think you should just say, no, I don't have any questions. But it's really important to ask a question that is important to you. And when I say important to you, the way you ask that question can also highlight why that question is important to you. So for example, you could say something like, can you tell me a little bit about the mentoring program that's offered here? Or you could say, I was at dinner last night with the residents, and your resident Margaret was telling me about the mentoring program that you have here and how amazing it was, and how her mentor was able to help her find grant money for a patient safety study. Would you be able to tell me a little bit more about the mentoring program that's offered and how a resident can make the most of that program? So now you're starting to see a little bit of context of why you're asking that. It is a question that is specific to the program. And it's also a question that's specific to you. So we have a saying with residency interviews, with interviews of any type, that if anybody else could have given that same exact response, it's really not a strong enough response. Alternatively, if you could give the same exact response at every single residency program, it's not a strong response. It's not a strong enough response. And the reason for that is your goal in this residency interview is to really convince them that you are the perfect fit for that program. Not necessarily that you're the best applicant ever, but that you mesh very well with the program's missions and goals and aims. And so, by the way, I'm so glad that you asked this question, because a lot of applicants don't realize that this question, what questions do you have for me, is probably one of the most common interview questions that you will be asked. So you're going to hear it over and over again. And so taking the time to really craft and formulate these questions and think about the way that you ask them is really important. Another example would be if you're interviewing at a family medicine program, and you could say, can you tell me about what sorts of procedures the residents learn how to do in your program? Or alternatively, you could say that, Dr. Smith, I'm from I'm from a rural area of Texas, and I would love to go back to that community and provide care. However, it is an underserved area, and we don't have a lot of specialists in that area. And so I do know that it's going to be important for me to learn to be able to offer different procedures. Can you tell me a little bit about the procedures that are offered here at your program? And another example would be, let's say if you are interested in patient safety. Instead of asking a question, can you tell me a little bit about the patient safety curriculum that you offer? You could say that, Dr. Patel, as you know, I've done several research projects in patient safety, and that's an area that's really important to me. When I was investigating your program, I was reading online about your patient safety curriculum, and then I was talking to my faculty mentor, Dr. Smith, and he had great things to say about your patient safety curriculum. Would you be able to tell me a little bit more about that? And can you tell me about how a resident might be able to make the most of those educational opportunities? So you can start to see how these questions are not generic, and they highlight something about you and why you're asking that question. So if you're trying to craft these kinds of questions yourself, you can start to see that it's really important. Number one, step one is reflection, and step two is research. And when I say reflection, that means to really go back and look into your own background. What is it that you are interested in? What have you spent time on? What sort of activities or volunteer activities or research projects or areas of specific areas of medicine? What are the ones that you've spent time in? What are you interested in? And what are your personal goals and missions in medicine? Whether that's patient safety, quality improvement, translational research, clinical research, epidemiology, care for the underserved, social determinants of health, health disparities, addressing health disparities. There are a lot of different areas of interest that I've seen in my, in applicants who I've spoken with. And so your goal is to sort of bring that out and think about, what are you interested in learning about this program? Now, the second part of answering this question well is research. And that means researching the program. And when I say researching the program, I don't mean just looking at their website. If you are doing this correctly, the research that you do on an individual program will help you answer many different residency interview questions. And so you do start with the website and you want to go really deep. And I talk about the AEIOU approach to researching a residency program. And A is for aims. What is the mission of this program? E is excellence. So areas of excellence. What is this program known for? I is initiatives. What do they want to be known for? O is for opportunities. What are some of the opportunities at this program that might not be available elsewhere? So for example, they have a particular multidisciplinary clinic or a specialty care clinic or collaborations across hospitals. And U is unique aspects of the program. And so you start with the website and then you start with a Google, and then you go on to a Google search. You want to look for press releases. You want to see about what they're in the news for. And you want to talk to your own faculty mentors to learn what they know about this residency program. You want to, if at all possible, talk to residents or faculty who are at that program to find out more about these particular areas. And then you can start to talk about things such as the patient safety curriculum, or the fact that they have this amazing program where they're addressing social determinants of health in a unique multidisciplinary collaborative approach with social work and other aspects across the hospital. So you can see that every residency program is unique and every applicant is unique. And so the questions you ask should reflect that. And that was a very long response, but I want you to start thinking about how you can move away from just what are the strengths of this program to really go deeper into these sorts of questions. And when that, and there will be a video posted on our YouTube channel. If you're not already subscribed, you'll be notified when that goes up, where I share a little bit more about some before and after examples.
And I'll just add, sorry, Alyssa.
No problem.
Add a couple of points. So usually you're only going to have time for one or two questions, but there have been situations where an interviewer will give you a lot more time. And so if you've only have one or two questions prepared, you may be at a loss of how to fill some of that additional time. So I do encourage all of our rotators to think about some additional questions. And of course, when you're asking questions, if you can focus intently on what the interviewer is saying, you can always ask follow-up questions related to your original question. So you can keep the conversation going, often in a very natural way with that approach. But I do want all of you to be aware that there are interviewers who will give you a lot of time. Program directors are especially known for doing this. There are some programs where program directors will interview every applicant that day, but because there are a large number of applicants, they may only spend 5 or 10 minutes with each applicant. And the first thing they'll say is, do you have any questions for me? And if you're not aware of that happening, then you're going to be caught off guard, right? And so now that you know that that will happen, you want to be ready for that. And the reason that they do that is they want to let their colleagues who interview you one-on-one, they're the ones who are going to ask you questions, and the program directors want to give the 5 or 10 minutes they have with you to answer your questions, because they know it's not like the old days where you can come and visit the program in person. So they're trying to be helpful in their mind. This is helpful to applicants because they can ask me anything and I can answer all those questions. But for applicants who are not expecting it, it doesn't come across helpful. It comes across nerve-wracking.
And I will add as well that you really want to be respectful of your interviewers' signals and their time. So if they do not ask you this question, don't ask your question. You might have prepared a beautiful question, but if they don't ask you if you have any questions, and then like I said, a lot of interviewers use it as their wrap up to an interview. So you don't want to keep going with questions if you are not invited to do so. So really pay close attention to the signals that you're getting from your interviewer.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add too that that YouTube video is live now. It's called Questions to Ask Residency Programs During a Residency Interview. The link is in the chat. It's also as well on our YouTube channel, so you can find it in both of those places. Our next question is very similar yet different. And the next question is, what should you not ask during your interview to the PD and residents?
So I'll take that. And you don't want to ask questions that would be best asked for, another resident or something like that. So you don't want to ask things about salary and vacation time and months of call and where are you going to rotate. You really want to keep those logistical or job-related questions for somebody else in the process. And I'll also add that you also don't want to ask questions that highlight a deficiency of the program. So for example, can you tell me about the research opportunities that are offered here at your program? Well, if you haven't done your research ahead of time about this program and you ask a question like that to a community family medicine program, you've just highlighted the fact that you don't fit well with this program. So it's really important to do that research ahead of time. Make sure you don't highlight those areas of deficiency. And then another one is you want to be careful about how you ask questions. So you don't ever want to say something like, why don't you have more patients who are underserved? And you can see that kind of question comes across a little accusatory. So you want to be careful in the way that you ask questions as well.
And I would also,
those are the 3 main points there.
Yeah, and just to add to what you said, Rajani, I also would stay away from the "do you have" questions, because if they don't have it and they end up saying no to the interviewer or the program director, they may feel that you might not like their program, or you may feel that their program is lacking or inadequate in some way. So I wouldn't ask the "do you have," for example, do you have a POCUS program here, a point of care ultrasound program? Well, good number of internal medicine programs do, but there are some that haven't yet launched that. And so that might not be the best way to ask it. Instead, you might want to ask them, Dr. Smith, one of the things that I've been seeing, especially during my internal medicine sub-internship, is the increasing use of ultrasound at the bedside to make help make clinical decisions. And I was wondering, what are some of the ways that I might be able to pick up some of those skills as I move through your residency program? Now, if the PD or the interviewer gets that and there is no POCUS program there, they can answer that in different ways. They might say, for example, when you do your cardiology rotation, 2 weeks of that block is going to be spent dedicated to echo. And you're really going to learn the principles of echocardiograms, and you're going to be able to, see how to apply that to patient care. So you're giving them more freedom to talk about an aspect of the program that's important to you without them saying, no, we don't have POCUS. Because if they do have POCUS, they'll also answer that as part of the question.
I'm going to highlight that Alyssa has added to the chat those posts as well, where we have a post about questions not to ask during a residency interview.
Yeah, definitely make sure to check that out. There's a lot of helpful resources there as well. Moving on to our next question, I think this is a very common question, and that is how to talk about yourself.
Samir, I'll let you address this.
Yeah, so I don't know if that question is directed at the question, tell me about yourself, but I'll
Yes.
assume that it is. So tell me about yourself is often the lead question to open the interview. And so we look at your answer as what we call a positioning statement. You are positioning yourself for what comes next, because quite often the next question that's asked is a follow-up to something that you've said. And so what I tell our rotators is to think very carefully about your background and think about those aspects of your background that would be appealing to that interviewer at that particular program. Now, of course, all of you have rich backgrounds and you've done a lot of different things, and you can't and shouldn't try to put all of that in your tell me about yourself answer, because the more you put in, the less impact anything you're saying has on the interviewer. So the way I look at this tell me about yourself answer is like, this is like a preview. So, your coming attractions. Like if you go to a movie theater and you see these previews, there are some previews that really get you excited, right? So this is kind of your way to get them excited about some things that they can ask you about later. So the things to keep in mind are, what is this program that you're interviewing? What are they about? Like, what is their mission? What are their goals? What's important to them? What are their values? Because if you know what that is, then you can insert some content into your answer that relates to that. So you can actually start to communicate some fit with the program, even at this early stage of the interview process. Most applicants will wait to show fit until they're asked, why are you interested in our program? But you can start to show a little bit of that in the tell me about yourself answer. So for example, if this program is one that serves a very underserved patient population, if this program is one that is dedicated to really helping their residents become stronger teachers, maybe producing clinician educators is something that's important to them. If you're aware of those things, you can embed a bit of that into your answer. So as you're talking about your previous background, perhaps you served as a teaching assistant in undergrad or med school, or maybe you had extensive tutoring, you may decide to layer a bit of that into your answer. You may decide when to say a little bit about your US clinical experience, and into that part of your answer, talk about the diverse patient population, the disadvantaged populations you've been caring for. All of this is strategic on your part, so that you're starting to show that fit. And then the follow-up question could very well be, oh, tell me more about your teaching, or tell me more about your your work with underserved populations here in the US. So, and that's great, because then you have a lot of things to say about those things, and those are strengths in your background. And as you go more into depth in the follow-up questions, you get more of a chance to show that fit. So these are some of the things to consider as you're crafting the tell me about yourself answer.
I will second Dr. Desai's comment that this is a positioning statement. And so I'll also add that your tell me about yourself may be different for different residency programs, depending on what you are trying to highlight as the points that emphasize your fit with this residency program.
All right, so for our next question, the question is how to talk about your weak areas if asked about.
Yeah, no, so that's a good question. Before your residency interview, you want to take stock of any areas that you consider weaknesses. So we talked about one of them just a bit ago. For example, if you have low step scores, and how to present that in a residency interview. There may be other things that you consider weaknesses. Maybe you took a bit longer to graduate from medical school. Maybe you had to take a leave of absence. Maybe there was some gap after medical school that you feel that programs might be concerned about. So there's any one of a number of things. So inventorying those things in advance of your interviews and thinking about how you would talk about those things is really, really important. And then, of course, there is the question, what is your, greatest weakness, or what are your weaknesses? And so that's a very common question. So I always tell people to have at least two ready to go. They may just ask for one, but just in case you have that interviewer that wants more than one, then you have something to offer. When selecting your weakness, try to pick something that is not going to prove damaging. So it's going to be very careful that after you pick something that you want to look at it from all angles and make sure that it's not going to be something that they would view as concerning for your performance as a resident. Remember, when crafting your answer about the weakness, you want to make sure that you have some very specific points of how you've worked to improve those areas. That's something that they're really going to be looking for. And of course, by the end of your answer, they want to know that you've had improvement in that area, but it should not feel like you've taken care of everything, because if you have, then it's really not a weakness anymore. So those are some tips to think about as you're creating your answer to that question.
Okay, so for our next question, it's asking about how to answer behavioral questions if we'd never encountered such experiences.
So this can be challenging when you're put on the spot. Tell me about a time when you had a conflict with a fellow student. And if you cannot come up with anything at all, that can be really challenging. So one of the things I will say is that preparation can help. And I recommend a technique I call story banking, where you can, on our website, we do have a list of some common behavioral interview questions. And what you can do is take a number of index cards and look over those behavioral interview questions. And what you can do is, on one side of the card, write down the question. And then on the other side, start to think about some different stories from your past that might represent a potential response. And so as you go through this, you'll find that you might only need a total of 5 stories, and those 5 stories can cover a number of different potential behavioral interview questions. So it is important to spend the time, because if you do not prepare for a behavioral interview question, you can really be caught off guard. And by the way, a behavioral interview question is one that asks about your behavior in the past in a specific situation. Tell me about a time when you had to stand up to somebody in a position of authority because you disagreed with them. Tell me about a time when you had a conflict with a coworker. And so there are a number of different behavioral interview questions that can be asked. If you draw a complete blank, then you try to go a little bit adjacent, a little bit sideways. I cannot think of a time when I had a conflict with a fellow student, but there was a time when I had a conflict with a coworker when I was working in medical school. And at that time, this is what happened and this is what I did. So if you can try to find a similar question, something that's close by, that should be sufficient. But it is really important to do that story banking ahead of time, to really think about those potential experience, those potential responses that encompass different experiences in your background.
That storyboarding, I think that's a very, very important point. And I also will highlight what you said about how some of these stories can be used for different questions. I think that's an important part of the prep, because in a typical interview, it's not common for the whole interview to be behavioral interview questions. It's typically 1 or 2 questions that could be behavioral, which is not to say that it never happens. You could have a purely behavioral interview. It has happened. but that's not a common situation. So these stories that you come up with, you can use them in different ways because there are some similarities between these questions.
And if you'd like to see an example of the STAR approach, which is what we recommend for behavioral interview questions, we do have a YouTube video that addresses the question of, tell me about a time when you were disappointed in your performance. And you can start to see a before and after response that I've recorded to that particular behavioral interview question.
Okay. So for our next question, I think it's kind of a compilation of what we've already answered, but they're just asking advice on how to successfully interview.
I think that is a bit of a compilation of what we have already gone over. I will say that one of the most important features is to really spend sufficient time in interview prep. What I found is that people spend months preparing for exams, and they might just spend days preparing for an interview. But this is the most important factor in residency selection once you've been accepted to interview. This is very important. So if you spend sufficient time, and when I talk about sufficient time, that is going over a list of potential questions and then really researching those residency programs and starting to spend those times. And as I said before, the number one goal should be to emphasize your fit with this particular residency program. So it really means understanding a lot about what you are looking for and what you are bringing to the program, and what the program is looking for and what they are bringing to the program.
Okay, so we have about 2 to 3 more questions from the Google form, and then I think we can take maybe 1 or 2 questions from the chat, and then we'll close it for the night. But our next question is asking how to act when you have no idea how to answer a question.
So I have a blog post on that, and it is, it's definitely a very anxiety-provoking situation. And you could ask, that's in the blog post. I do have several responses that you can use. An example of one would be, Dr. Patel, that's a really interesting question. Do you mind if I take just a moment to think about that? And if after you think about it for a moment, you really have no idea how to proceed, you can just be straightforward and say, I don't think I have a good response for that. But if at all possible, to try to give a response, even if it's less than perfect, just to be able to go for it with that response is fine as well. You can also, at the end of the interview, if you've thought about a response, you can say, Dr. Patel, I was thinking about that question that you asked me earlier. Would it be okay if I gave you a response now to that? So having a few of those phrases ready to go can be very helpful.
I'll also say that quite often when you're asked a question that you're not sure how to answer, that you've actually prepared for it, but you may not be recognizing that the way the question is asked is simply a variation of another question you've worked on. So we actually have a blog post that categorizes questions into different groups so that you can recognize the similarities between the questions. For example, it's very common to be asked, why are you interested in our program? But there are different ways that an interviewer could ask that same question. Okay, so they could say, what are you looking for in a program? Now that sounds different, right, than why are you interested in our program? But really, your answer can be very much the same. There's some tweaks you can make to the answer, but it's really a variation of the why are you interested in our program. Okay, so one of the things you want to do in your interview prep is try to group like-minded questions together so that you can see how they're related to each other. So that therefore, when you get asked a variation, it doesn't appear to you as completely foreign. I want to add one thing to what Rajani said about pausing. I think pausing is a very effective technique. If you're going to use that in an interview, it's important to practice that in your mock interviews because you want to feel what it's like to pause for 5 to 10 seconds. If you've never done that before and you do it for the first time in your real interview, there's a good chance that while you're pausing for 5 to 10 seconds to collect your thoughts, instead of collecting your thoughts, you're thinking about, oh my gosh, I'm not saying anything. I'm not saying anything. And you're not using those 5 to 10 seconds to your best use. So if you practice pausing, you're going to be better able to use the pause effectively in a real situation should the need arise.
And in terms of Dr. Desai's point about how we've categorized the questions, in the book, The Successful Match, in the interview chapter, we have the question, and then we have a list of other ways that a program could ask that question. And in the blog post that Alyssa has included in the chat, these 275 common residency interview questions will help you prepare. That 275 questions breaks down into about 30 parent questions. So, it is very helpful to look at that list of 30 questions and to see how else that could be asked.
Okay, so our next question asks how to answer why should we choose you in a competitive program with Ivy League students as an IMG?
Yeah, so why should we choose you is another common question. It can also be asked as, why should we pick you? What sets you apart from other applicants? How do you stand out? These are all essentially the same question, but you do want to have a well-prepared answer to how should we pick you. Now, if you've received an interview at a place that's an Ivy League institution, or they have a lot of applicants from Ivy Leagues, or most of their resident class is from that type of medical school, the first thing I want you to realize is you've received that interview because that program has deemed you to be a competitive candidate for your program, for their program. And so what you want to do is identify something compelling in your background that you want to share with them. And since this question is often asked towards the end of the interview, it's really part of the lasting impression that you can make. And so you should try to identify something that, again, would be appealing to that program. It may be something related to their mission or their goals. It could be something related to quality that you have. Perhaps there's something that you want to tell them about that you haven't told them about before. And you want to try to do it in a compelling way. So you don't want to speak about it in a general sense. You want to be very specific about what you're saying. And if you can tell a very strong story, a powerful story to really drive home what it is that makes you stand out, quite often the story is what people remember more than anything else. And if you can be remembered for that story, you've really, said something that really resonates with that interviewer. So those are some tips that I would offer you when you're trying to construct the why should we choose you.
And I'll just add to that was typically my closing question. And most of the people that I interviewed, again, amazing applicants, very many of them sounded similar. So you should choose me because I'm a really hard worker and I really believe in collaboration, and I would come to work every day ready to work hard. Versus what Dr. Desai said, I think you should choose, I know there are lots of great applicants here today. I think one of the reasons that you should choose me is that, and then point out a specific item in your background that meshes well with the goals of the program, and in the form of a story, that's far more memorable than just listing off 3 qualities, especially since most people use the same 3 qualities.
Okay, so we're on to our final question of the night, and our final question is, virtual interview background setup tips. So I think we have a lot of information for this.
Yeah, and there is a blog post that we've done on the virtual interview, things to do ahead of time and things to do during. And so there are a number of aspects of that. I think that is a really important blog post to read before you have your virtual interview, to really go into the specifics about that.
Okay, so that concludes our Google Form questions. We do have 2 questions from the chat. One of them we've already answered. It's how to answer, tell me about yourself. So the next question I think we could answer is, I have a new LOR uploaded to my ERAS. Should I add it to the programs and let them know about it? If I do that, will my application go to the bottom of the applications list that's already sent?
Yes, so you should add it to your application. So if you have that open spot, go ahead and add it to that spot. That will make it available to the residency programs. That doesn't mean the residency programs will act upon it. They'll receive some notification that something new has happened with your application. But I always tell applicants to follow that up with an email to each program indicating that this new component of your application is now available. It gives you a reason to reach out to them. And sometimes that effort is what it takes to get you the interview. But no, your application doesn't go into the bottom of the pile if you add a new letter.
Okay, so that concludes all of the questions for tonight. So I'll go ahead and wrap up. Just want to say thank you to everybody who joined us tonight and to those who submitted their questions using the Google form and in the chat. We always appreciate hearing your guys' questions and answering them. I did also want to say that if there's any questions that you have at the end of the webinar or at any time, or any questions that you maybe want to discuss privately, please feel free to reach out to any one of us on our team, including Dr. Desai. We're always happy to help you with anything that you need, and you're part of our MDDB Connect family, and we want to make sure that we're there for you. Even if it's just something simple, please feel free to reach out to any one of us. As a reminder, there will be a recording of this webinar being sent out later this week. So that will be sent out from me and you guys will receive that. And I think that's it from me. Dr. Desai, any final words?
No, I want to just echo everything that Alyssa said, that we are here for you. Most of you have my direct line. For those of you who are new to our program, I'll be reaching out to you. So you'll have a easy way to get a hold of me. So you can always reach out, text or call with questions, not just during your rotation, but even after the rotation ends. I always love to hear from you and see how you're doing. And of course, I'm rooting for your success. I know this is a stressful time in the application cycle, and I'm rooting for all of you to get as many interviews as you can. And of course, the best during each and every one of your interviews.
I'll second that. We're wishing you all the best. Good luck to you.
Alrighty. Well, thanks everybody for joining and have a great night.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.